To complete the basic permanent wave wrap, which is also known as a straight set wrap, all the rods within a panel move in the same direction. In most cases, you're going to start completing the center panel. So 2 working parts. You can start at the apex and just roll all the back, and then you can do your front section, but remember everything is rolled in the same direction. So our base placement is half base, our base direction is horizontal, and our wrapping technique is crokinole. You can also, if the hair gets shorter, you might want to change to a size smaller rod once you hit the occipital bone. So in this case, if it did get shorter, I would change to a blue rod. If you were wrapping all of this in gray, you would change to a pink rod down here. So that is an option as well. Once you get to the sides, this is pretty much just like you've practiced probably. Once you get to the sides, we divide this into 2. To do that, take your perm rod, and you can see where length of a perm rod is. So to make that panel, we can't just go straight down, because if we did go just straight down, you can see our panel's wider here and it's very narrow here, too narrow for our rod. So what we need to do is follow the curve of the client's hairline. So we need to take our rod, follow the curve of that hairline, and we can see it's going to take us to behind the ear. So once you've determined where you're going to start, just take your comb and make a curved parting to behind the ear, not too far behind the ear. And then you want to make sure that each panel is going to fit a rod. So we're going to have our rods here. We can see this will also fit a rod. I might go a little bit further back, right where this area recedes in. And there we have our 2 panels. So remember, this has to be a curved line to follow the curve of the hairline. We don't start in the front panel. We always start in the back and work our way towards the front. When we're starting, just take your comb and place it horizontally. You can see that that gives you a triangle shape. So using the diameter of your rod, we're just going to go narrow to wide, and there we have a triangle shape which we're going to fit a rod in. You'll want to determine, is that triangle, does it require a short half-size rod or a long rod? In my situation here, it looks like it would be a short rod. So I'm going to use the short pink rod. Bookend style wrap is what we're using. And once we have that first rod in place, remember, let your elastic go so that you have a nice straight elastic. Once we have our first rod in place, now we need to go from narrow to wide. So we're going to do a couple of rods narrow at the back to wide at the front. The reason we do the narrow to wide is if we just kept going straight, our perm rods would end up straight down here, and there would be hair here that would drag or would not be in a perm rod. By pivoting this slightly, we make a turn and follow the shape of the head, and then we can just continue down straight. So usually it's 2 rods we need to pivot, and once we've pivoted those 2 rods, then we can just keep going straight, just like we did in the back panel. So remember, the narrow part is at the back of the head. The wider part is the diameter of your perm rod. Don't let it get too wide. So now another narrow to wide. Make sure your section is okay. And hopefully you've done some practice down the center panel. When you get onto the sides of the head, it does get a little trickier because there's more curves in the side of the head, so we do have to follow the shape of the head a bit more. Okay, so now you can see that those rods have changed, and now when I go to do my next perm rod, target part, I'm probably going to be pretty straight. So this section here, you can see now I'm a pretty straight line. Just got to clean up my panel in the front. You'd never want to take hair from one section into another because that could lead to breakage when you actually put the solution on. So take the time to make sure your section is nice and neat and that your subsections are nice and neat. So target part. And now we just keep going straight. Check your section again if need be. We could use a clip there to hold that, or a perm rod to hold that hair out of place. And remember, your body position is important as well. You need to stand straight out from the middle of your section. That's where your body position should be. Your palm needs to be up to ensure that you have good control. Just gonna switch to the other side. I'm hoping you'll be able to see a little better that way. Remember to comb right from the root area. And try to balance it out, so however many rods you use on the left side, you're also using the same amount of rods on the right side. If you see a large gap between your rods, you would know that you're probably taking too big of subsections. And if your rods are pushing each other up and out of the way, if they're crowded, then you're taking too small of subsections. So our rods, even though we had a bit of a pivot here, the rods do stay horizontal, and that is very important. We keep those rods horizontal when we're performing the basic permanent wave wrap. So once you get down to past the ear, you may find that this section, the panel or section, becomes a little bit narrower. And if that is the case, you'll need to switch to a short perm rod. And remember, you also have the option of switching to a size smaller as you reach this occipital bone area here. So from here down, now I can do a size smaller because it is a narrower section. And try to balance everything out. If I went a size smaller on my right side, I should do a size smaller down here on my left side. This center panel, it's really important that it is centered, and that way you won't have things happening like you've got a wider side panel on the left compared to the right. Remember, you should always be able to see your elastics. Don't count on your elastics to do the tension for you. Good tension is the way you're rolling the hair. It shouldn't be the way you position your elastic. And don't try and use all the hair down below here. Just because you get near the end, don't put it all in one rod. Make sure you're using the diameter of the rod to determine the subsection all the way down. Okay, so now we can see that we do have no space here. Everything is, these rods touch each other, which is very important. That shows us that we followed the curve of the head. You can almost see a bit of a curve to that panel, to that back panel. So now when we do the front panel, and remember, never do your front panel first, because then you're working in between two wrapped panels, and it's a little difficult to work in between. Also, if you ever want to pre-saturate the hair, we always pre-saturate and then we wrap from back to front, because the hair in the back of the head is always a little more coarse, and that's where we start wrapping right away. So it gives you a good habit to get into if you always wrap from back to front. So now when we start to do our front, we have to remember also that this head has some shape in the front as well. So we need to make sure that we're following that shape as we move on. We just start with a straight section, and then as the head curves, we may need to take some narrow to wide sections, but this time the sections will be narrow in the front and wider in the back if we need that. So remember, this is the basic permanent wave wrap. It's also known as a straight set wrap. We'll do a similar wrap called an alternate basic wrap. And basically it's the same thing, except that we change these rods here. So remember, subsection, target part. Now make sure you get all the hair. Don't let it get stuck to your mannequin, or if you're working on a client, don't let it get stuck to your client's skin, because that hair will not get curled. And then the client will have a few straight hairs hanging down, and that won't be good. Remember to rock and roll all the way up to the scalp. Let this elastic go so it's nice and straight as you position it. Now when we get in to this area here, which is the receding area, you'll notice a lot of clients' heads might curve here. And if that is the case, we need to always make sure that we are tilting the rod slightly inward. So our rod needs to hit this side at the same time as it hits this side of the head. For good tension. If you find you have some looping here, where it's a little looser here, just give your rod a little tilt towards her face as you're positioning that rod. Now in the receding area, we can go wide to narrow right here, a little bit narrow here, a little bit wider there, just a slight pie shaping. And what that does is it allows us to follow the curve of the client's head. Some clients have more curve to their head than others. Make sure your ends are always tucked inside the end paper as you're wrapping. We don't want to create any fishhook ends. Make sure you can see your elastics, that they're not tucked inside. So now I'm going to do another wider to narrow. And remember, the wider part is never wider than the rod that you're using though. And once I've got this one in, it's probably just going to be going straight down . Now I can just do a straight one, and this is near the flat of the head now. So when you're near the flat of the head, it's easy just to go straight. You usually don't need to pivot or take any pie shapings. When you get down towards the sideburn area of the client, the bottom of the hairline near the ear, you may have just enough hair, a small amount of hair, that can be used with a half-size rod. And if that's the case, use your half-size rod. Don't put a long rod in there, and it will just flop all over and be uncomfortable for the client. So go with the short rod. Just gonna let that elastic go. It looked a bit twisted. Remember, we don't want any twists. We want that elastic to be nice and straight. So you can see in here, the hair that I have remaining is just a small piece of hair. So I'm going to put a half-size rod in there. The pink rod's still the same diameter, it's just a little different shade of pink, a different company, that's all, manufacturer. And now we can see there is a slight curve to that as well. When we look at our side panels, we have followed the shape of her hairline. Okay, so this is the this is the basic permanent wave wrap, also known as the straight set wrap. We've wrapped everything on a base placement of half base. The base direction is horizontal and the wrapping technique is crokinole, and the end wrap technique is bookend. If you feel you need to use single flat as you're wrapping, go ahead and do that though. But usually with a nice even cut mannequin, the bookend is all that we need. Remember, we start by making two working parts to create our center panel. You can start wrapping right at the front, everything wraps back, or you can wrap from the apex back and then put your front panel in later. When you get to the sides, we divide this in half with a curved parting. We take the first section straight across and determine if we need a half size or a full size rod, and then we pivot 2 rods narrow to wide, narrow at the back to wide, narrow to wide, and then usually just straight down. Now if you needed 3 rods to make that turn, you could go ahead and use 3 rods, and maybe you only need 1 rod. The important thing is that you make the curve so that these rods are touching these rods. We don't have drag here where hair is being pulled and or we don't have an empty spot here, right? The important thing is that we follow and are able to fill in our panel with rods without having to put any vertical rods or anything. Then that leaves us our front panel. Remember, we always wrap the back panel first, and when we wrap the front panel, just to follow the curve of the head, and sometimes you just can go horizontally all the way, but sometimes you need to go narrow at the front, wider at the back. A couple of pivots in the receding area that follows the shape of the head. All your rods should be sitting horizontally. If your rods are sitting on a diagonal, then something is wrong, so make sure that they are sitting nice and horizontal. Every time you finish a panel, just double check, make sure you have even tension, there's no looping, but the rods aren't so tight that they can't move, because when we put that perm solution on, remember the hair softens and expands, and the rods have to have that little bit of room to be able to expand. Always check all your elastics. Make sure you can see your elastics and they're not twisted and not going to leave an indent in the hair. Whenever you're doing a permanent wave, when you're first starting, always call your teacher and ask them to do a check, making sure that everything is okay before you put that chemical on. Because once you put the chemical on, that's it. It changes the structure of the hair. It's not like we can wet it down and take away what we did. We need to have it checked, make everything perfect, because this is permanent. That's why it's called a permanent wave. So that's the basic permanent wave straight set wrap, also another name for it. And remember, lots of practice with this, and really if you're having difficulty with this, just section out this side panel and pivot, practice pivoting, practice pivoting, practice pivoting in the front. And practice is what makes you better at permanent waving, and always make sure your ends are in your end papers as well. And just keep practicing. Basic permanent wrap.